This tutorial focuses on using K2 Studio to build workflows and advance smart objects. We want to save some time though by providing a starter project that contains the user interfaces, in other words, smart forms, and also provides a smart box based smart object already created. We do have some other tutorials that go into more detail on creating basic Smartbox smart objects and smart forms if you'd like to check those out. You need to deploy this starter project in your environment before starting the rest of the tutorial. So in step 1, we will explain how to download and deploy the starter project to your environment. Let's get started. If you don't have your web browser open, bring it up in your environment. And then go to the following URL located at http://help.k2.com/files/9872 and download the K2 project file there. It's probably easiest if you save it to your desktop. When you see a message with the options to either open the file, save, or save as down at the bottom of your browser screen, you can select Save As and save the file to your desktop by selecting that option from the upper left of the window. Okay, once we get that saved, the next task is to deploy the package to our environment by using the K2 Package and Deployment tool. K2 provides this tool to help us deploy application elements for K2 across different environments. You can launch this tool by going down into your Start menu and select All Programs, K2 Black Pearl, and then select K2 Package and Deployment. This is assuming you're working from a K2 virtual machine. If you are working in your own organization's environment, you will need to make sure you have the K2 components installed locally to use this tool. From the right side Actions column, you can click Deploy Package. And for the file name, let's browse to the K2 project file that we just previously saved to the desktop. The file name you will find is k2learning-100.edi_k2studiointro.kspx. When you get that selected, keep the default values on the rest of the window for the remaining deployment options and click Next. Moving on to the Validate the Deployment Package screen, put a check in the box next to K2 Learning to select all of the package elements. You may need to wait a few seconds until you see the Ready indicator in the status column here. Once you see that, you can click Next to continue. You may need to allow a minute or two for the Package and Deployment tool to process and complete. I'll pause the video here to save some time. Great! When you see the green success indicators next to the deployment descriptions, you can click Finish, and then close the K2 Package and Deployment tool as we have the package deployed to our environment at this point. Let's confirm that the forms and smart object have been deployed. Launch K2 Designer by going to your Start button, go into All Programs, K2 Black Pearl, open up K2 Smart Forms, and select K2 Designer. Now, if the shortcut is not on your desktop or if you are not using a K2 provided virtual machine for this tutorial, you may need to check with your administrator to find out what the web address is for your K2 Designer environment. Once K2 Designer has opened, you can browse to the following category, open up All Items, go into K2 Learning, and take a look at the Temporary Access application. You should see the following item view, form, and 2 smart objects in this category. If all 4 artifacts are there, the deployment was successful and you can continue with the tutorial. To quickly review, in this step we downloaded and deployed a starter project for this tutorial. The starter project contains a view, a form, and 2 smart objects. We will be using these items in the workflow and the composite smart object tutorials later on. The work we will be doing in step 2 will lead us to creating a new project with K2 Studio, and we will be adding a blank workflow to this project. To complete this step, you will need to have the K2 components installed on your local machine. If you are on a K2 virtual machine, this has already been done for you. If you're on your own machine, you may need to speak with your K2 administrator to help you get this set up. Let's begin by launching K2 Studio. Go down into the Start menu and select All Programs, K2 Black Pearl, And we can select K2 Studio from here. Once that opens up, click on File and select New. We're going to set up a new K2 project file with the following settings. For K2 type, select K2 project if it isn't set by default already. And the same with K2 template, also select K2 project. For project name, we're going to call it K2 Learning. Down in the location section, feel free to select a location of your choice. I will save mine to a K2 Learning project file under the folder C K2 Learning. For target framework, we can leave it set to the default value. Click on the Create button when you have that all filled in. Once you get the new project created, let's right-click on the K2 Learning node up here under the Solution Explorer, and then hover over Add and select Folder. For organizational purposes, let's just name this new folder Temporary Access Application. Right-click on this new folder, hover over Add Item, and select New Project Item. On this next window, notice that K2 Process and Blank Process are both pre-selected for you, which is exactly what we want for this step in the tutorial. Give the new process a name of Temporary Access Application Workflow, and click Create. You'll want to save your work by going up and clicking on File and click Save. Let's preserve this work up to this point. In this step, we basically created a new K2 Studio project and added a blank workflow to this project. We used a specific folder structure in this project so that the workflow that is deployed later on will go into the existing category out in the K2 environment that was created for this application when we deploy the starter project using the K2 package and deployment tool. In step 3, we will add a data field to the workflow. Then we will configure this workflow to start when the temporary access application smart form is submitted. The data field in this example is necessary because later on we will use this field to bind the workflow reporting data with the access request data. We will then create a composite smart object that joins these two data sources, essentially allowing us to create a report that combines workflow reporting data with business data. A note here, the majority of this wizard configuration is specific to smart forms. This is because we want a smart form to start this particular workflow. If you are going to use a different mechanism to start a workflow in one of your own projects later on, the configuration and wizard screens will be different. Other tutorials will illustrate how to set up workflows to start with different forms or different event-based mechanisms. The main thing to understand here is that we are using a wizard to configure how the workflow will be started. Back in K2 Studio, we will add a data field to the workflow so that we can store the ID of the specific access request record that is associated with an instance of a running workflow. We can do this by opening the object browser down here on the left side of the K2 Studio window and select the Process Activity Data tab. Right-click on the process name in the Process Activity Data tab and select Add. In here, we'll add a data field with the following settings. For name, enter in record ID, all as one word. And then for data type, make sure integer is selected, and you can click OK. The next task is to associate this workflow process with our smart form and configure the workflow to start when the temporary access request smart form is submitted. Click on the Process Wizards group of options on the left side of the window now. Then drag and drop the Smart Forms Integration Wizard into the Start step of the workflow over here on the canvas. This will add the hooks we need for the workflow automatically into the smart form. Click Next to skip past the wizard welcome page, and on the screen called Select Form and State, use the Browse icon to open up the context browser. Within the Environment tab, open up both Smart Forms Servers groups if they aren't already selected, and then drill into K2 Learning, select the Temporary Access Request form, and drag and drop the form into the form text box on the left. For the state of the form, let's select Use an existing state and pick the new request default state. And then click Next to continue. Within the window called Configure Workflow Start Rule, open the drop-down list called Select Rule and select the rule called When Button Submit is clicked. If you happen to see a warning message, go ahead and click OK to accept the warning. Now we want to use the Move Up button to move the Start Workflow action up so that it happens right before the message is shown to the user. You can see how I'm doing that right here. What we're doing is we're telling the workflow to start when the user clicks the Submit button on the Access Request form. Keep in mind, this particular configuration is specific to K2 Smart Forms. In other projects, as a reminder, if you use a different forms technology besides Smart Forms, you will configure the workflow start rule a bit differently. Let's click Next to continue. On the screen called Configure Item Reference, select the Create Item Reference option and name the item reference Temporary Access Request. Now use the ellipses button to browse for and select the Temporary Access Request Smart Object. You can drag it into the Smart Object field. I'll show you how to do that here on my screen. It's located on the Environment tab area down in the SmartForms server grouping under K2 Learning. Notice how it's tied to the Request Item view specifically under the Request form. Now what we're doing is we've set up a shortcut to the data items so that the workflow is associated with a specific temporary access request record that was created by the form. You will learn more about item references in other tutorials. For now, just think of an item reference as a pointer or a shortcut so that the workflow can easily work with the specific record that is associated with the workflow instance. You will see how the shortcut helps us later on in the workflow when we configure wizards that need to use data that was captured by the form. We can close the Browse Tree view now, and then click Next to continue. On the Specify Data Bindings and Folio screen, let's click on Add, and then click on the first ellipses icon on the left side to select the Record ID data field that we created earlier. You'll find it under the Process Activity Data tab under Data Fields. You can either drag and drop this field into the data field box or select it and click the Add button. If you do drag it, just be sure to close the context browser. Next, click on the second ellipses icon and select the ID property of the Temporary Access Request Smart Object as demonstrated here. You'll find this one under the Environment tab. Down in the SmartForms service groupings, go into K2 Learning Temporary Access Application, Temporary Access Request Form under the Temporary Access Request Item view, and from here select the ID and click Add to put it in the form field text box. That looks good, so let's move on. For the folio, let's use the ellipses button again to configure this folio field to use the full name and company of the Temporary Access Request Smart Object. Let's touch on what we just did with this mapping scenario. We configured the wizard so that the form will pass the ID of the new record that was created into the Record ID data field of the workflow. This will allow us to join the workflow reporting data with the request data in a later exercise. We also set up the workflow folio so that it will use the full name and company that was entered by the requester on the form. This will allow us to easily see which access request workflows are associated with specific external people. You can close the tree view and click Next and Finish to complete the SmartForms wizard. Let's be sure to save our workflow at this point. In this step, we added a data field to the workflow and configured the workflow to start when the temporary access application form is submitted. As part of the configuration, we specified when the workflow should be started, and we hooked up an item reference so that the workflow can easily read data from the access request record in other wizards. We also set up data mappings to transfer data between the access request smart object and the workflow. The majority of this configuration is specific to SmartForms because we want a SmartForm to start the workflow here. Moving on to step 4, we will add a client event, which we typically call a user task, to the workflow. To make things a little bit easier in this workflow, we will be reusing the same temporary access request form for multiple user tasks. Within that form, we will be using a specific state of the form for each task, while the approval task being added in step 4 will have 2 actions, those being approve and reject. There will actually be 3 outcomes. One of them will be rejected if the approver rejects the request, and then the other 2 outcomes branch off of approved. We will have approved and Active Directory account required, where the approver approved the request and the workflow must create an Active Directory account for the temporary user. We will also have approved and Active Directory account not required, where the approver approves the request and the workflow does not need to create an Active Directory account for the temporary visitor. You will see later on why we were configuring the outcomes this way, but essentially we are taking a different path in the workflow depending on whether an Active Directory account is required or not. Let's get moving by selecting the Event Wizards pane over here on the left, and drag and drop a SmartForms client event into the workflow just below the Start event. We can click Next on the Wizard Welcome page to move on to the Select Form and State screen. On that screen, let's change the event name to Manager Approval. We need to find the SmartForm to associate with this task, so you can open the Context Browser option for the Select Form box. And from the Environments tab, let's get the Temporary Access Request form. It's located down in the Temporary Access category under the SmartForms server groupings. We can select and add it from here. Finally, let's configure the state to use the existing approval state. That's in this dropdown. We should be done with the settings on this window, so let's click Next. Leave the Configure Item Reference screen as it is. It's going to automatically be configured to use the existing Temporary Access Request Item Reference that we created earlier. Let's click Next from here, and click Next again on the Specify Form Parameters screen, as we don't need to do anything there. The Configure Open Worklist Item Role screen should automatically be configured to open the task when the form is initializing, so we can click Next. And we can move on past the screen called Transfer Workflow Data to Form, as it should be configured correctly by default. This will take us into configuring the actions for this user task now. On the Configure Actions screen, use the Add button to add the following 2 actions. We'll start with Approved, and then Rejected. When you get those entered in, you can click Next. Leave the Action Display Settings screen as it is. Click Next again. We don't have a need to configure any data transfer here, so click Next on the Transfer Form Data to Workflow screen. This brings us to the Configure Outcomes screen. We will be adding an extra approved related outcome and configuring the currently existing approved outcome. Remember, our requirement was to have one outcome be for approved and an Active Directory account being required, and the other outcome is it's approved without the need for an Active Directory account. First, select the existing approved outcome and click Edit from the menu at the top. Notice there is already a condition in here that allows for all slots to be approved. We're going to actually set this up to be the path for the Active Directory account being needed with the approval. We can do this by clicking on the Add button here to add another condition to this outcome to check the Active Directory required field in our item reference. We can configure this outcome condition so that it evaluates as the following. Set the Boolean operator to AND. We'll be checking the value for the AD login required field to handle this over in the user form as it was filled out by the originator to determine if we need an Active Directory account created. Use the Context Browser to go into the Process Activity Data tab, open the Item Reference group down here, locate and add the Temporary Access Request AD Login Required field. Great, now let's set the comparison operator to equal, and put the word true in for the second variable. At this point, your screen should look like mine. We can click OK to close the outcome configuration screen. Let's also change the edited outcome name value here to approved and AD account required. This will just add in some clarity for this outcome. To recap what we just did, we took the original approved outcome that was generated by K2 based on the approved action and edited that outcome to evaluate some data from the request in addition to the user's input. This outcome will ultimately result in a line in the workflow that will be followed if the request is approved and an AD account is required. In the next few steps, we will configure another outcome that will be followed if the request is approved and an Active Directory account is not required. Click OK to move on. Let's click on the Add button here to add a new outcome. We can name it Approved and AD Account Not Required. We will also need to create our own conditions for this outcome, so click the Add button here and add a condition that uses the first variable. It should be set by default as action result. We'll set the logical function to be set to all slots. The comparison operator is equal, and second variable should be set to the word approved. You can click OK when you're done. Now we need to add a second condition to the outcome to account for not needing an Active Directory account. Let's click Add. Make sure the Boolean operator is set to AND. Then from the item reference in the context browser again, grab the AD login required field from the temporary access request item reference for the first variable. Comparison operator should be equal. Second variable should be false in this case because we don't want to push out a user task to our IT department to create an Active Directory account if it's not necessary. You can click OK at this point. Your outcome should look something like this on my screen. Click OK again if you're happy. Let's select the Approved and AD Account Not Required outcome and use the Move Up button here to move it up next to the other approved outcomes so that they are next to each other. The Configure Outcomes screen should look something like this. We're doing this because we want these two options to be evaluated in this order. When you're ready, click Next to continue. Here we are going to determine which user should approve this request. In this application, the approver name is being saved along with the request data, so we can read the approver login name from the Access Request Smart Objects item reference. On the destination user screen, click the Add button, and then use the ellipses button to select the approver login name field from the temporary Access Request item reference as shown here. You can click Next to set up a notification message. On the Event Notification Settings screen, let's select the option to notify participants when they receive a work item, and then we'll customize the notification email as well. Before moving to the next window with this customization, let's take a moment to modify the subject line to describe the task and add the full name value from the item reference for even more clarity. Enter in the text Temporary Access Request Approval for with a space at the end, and then get the approver login name field from the item reference over in the context browser. You can drag that field over to the end of the subject line. We can click Next at this point. Now for the event notification message body, we want to add some more informational values from the item reference so that the approver has all the info they need to approve or reject the request by using an email reply directly, that is if they want to. In this sample, I'll include the following fields: full name, company, start date, end date, and requester. I'll add some more descriptive information around those fields, but feel free to add whatever information you like from the item reference into the body of your message. I'm going to pause the video here to build this message, and then we'll come back to check it out. Okay, you can see how I built this message out with the body here. When you're done with the email message on your own screen, feel free to close the context browser tree view window if you have it open, and click Finish to complete the client event wizard. Save your workflow at this point, and let's take a moment to review what we just did. In this step, we added a client event to the workflow for the manager approval task. We configured the event to use the temporary access request form and configured the outcomes to follow a different path depending on whether the workflow should create an Active Directory account or not. This basically shows us how we can configure more advanced outcomes that evaluate data as well as user input. Then, in later steps, we used a variable for the destination username being the approver login name that was filled in on the form rather than a static username as the user for the approval task. and then we customize the task notification email that is sent to the approver. In the next step, we will do some cleanup and formatting of our workflow on the canvas and then add some placeholder activities that we will configure later on in the tutorial. With step 5, we will format the layout of the workflow on the design canvas as it sits now. Then we will add a few blank activities and connect them with lines. This is all in preparation for adding server tasks to handle the approval and rejected paths of the workflow. The goal of this step is to teach you how to drag activities, lines, and labels around and join them together so that you can become a little more familiar with the design canvas of the Workflow Designer. Let's start by moving the new activity in the workflow so that it lies directly underneath the Start step. To do this, you can move your mouse over the box icon for the activity, and then click and hold your mouse button down and drag it under the Start activity. Next, let's rename the new activity by double-clicking the activity's name area where it says Default Activity, and enter the word Approval. You can click OK if you see a warning message when you do this. You can safely ignore this warning. Next, go down to the left side of the window and open the Activity Wizards pane, and drag and drop 3 blank activities onto the canvas in the general area as shown on my screen. Once you've dropped all those activities on the design canvas, the next thing we're going to do is rename each of the 3 new activities as follows. For the one in the upper right, double-click on the text and enter in Rejected. Moving down, click on this one and add in Create AD Account. And then for the third one, enter in Approved. Now let's grab the arrowhead for each line that comes out of the approval activity and attach the lines to these new steps so that the workflow knows where to go when that activity completes. When the mouse pointer changes to a hand over one of these lines, you can grab that end of the line and move it around to another activity. You also have the ability to move the start of the line once you get that set, but you cannot detach the start of a line from an activity. This is because lines flow out of activities and are bound to them as the source. I'll demonstrate that with the Approved AD Account Not Required line. With this line, you may want to move both ends as shown here. Then we can move the Approved with AD Account Required line down to the Create AD Account activity. Finally, with both ends of the rejected line, you'll want to move it over to the rejected activity as shown here. Next, we want to draw a line between the Start step and the Approval step. We can do this by right-clicking in the Start activity somewhere around the icon. And when you see the pointer turn into a pencil, drag the new line down into the Approval activity. When you're done, K2 will draw an arrow line between the 2 activities. Now let's right-click on the rejected line and select Label. Rotate left to rotate the label name. You can then mouse over the line label text and click and drag it around to put it in a place that makes more sense for reading the workflow. Repeat the Label Rotate Left option for the Approved and AD Account Required line and move that label accordingly. I'll do that here. You may also need to move the text label for the Approved AD Account Not Required line as well. The last thing we're going to do is draw a line between the Create AD Account activity and the Approved activity. Since we want the workflow to continue on this path when this activity completes, with that, your workflow should look pretty close to what mine looks like here on the screen. When you're ready, do a quick save on the workflow. In this step, we did some workflow layout formatting, added some new steps to the workflow, and drew lines to hook up the flow of the workflow. In the next step, we will add server tasks into the new activities that we just dropped on the canvas. In step 6, which is our final step in part 1 of this tutorial, we will be adding server-based tasks to the new blank activities that we just added to the workflow canvas. We will add 2 events to the rejected step, a smart object call to set the status of the request, and an email event to notify the originator. We will also add an event to create a new Active Directory user account in the Create AD Account activity, and finally use the copy and paste function to add another event in the Approved activity to set the request status accordingly. We'll get this moving by switching to the Event Wizards pane over here on the left, and then drag and drop a Smart Object event into the Rejected activity. I'll demonstrate. Okay, when you drop this event into the Rejected activity, the wizard is going to automatically start. You can click Next on the first step of the wizard, and on this next screen, let's name the event Set Status Rejected, and then we're going to use the ellipses icon to locate the following method in the context browser. Go into the Environment tab, open up Smart Object Server, and then Smart Object Server again, then drill into K2 Learning, Temporary Access Application, Temporary Access Request Smart Object, and then grab the Save method under the Single Method group. You can either drag the method into the Smart Object Method text box when you have located it and then close the context window, or you can just select the Save method and click the Add button. I'll do that here. Let's click Next. On the Input Mapping screen, locate the ID property and then click the Assign button. We have to tell K2 which specific record we want to update. Remember that the ID of the access record is saved in the Record ID data field that we added to the workflow properties earlier. We will be mapping this data field to the ID input property. On the Assign Mapping screen, you can click the ellipses icon and then locate and drag and drop the Record ID field that exists in the Process Activity Data tab. Once you get that done, you can close the context browser and then click OK to close the Assign Mapping screen. Also, on the Input Mapping screen here, let's locate the Status property and click Assign. Go ahead and enter in Rejected as the status for this request. Then you can click OK. Let's click Next, Next again, and then Finish to complete this wizard. Just to touch back on what we did, we told the workflow to call the Save method of the Temporary Access Request Smart Object. This is because we want to update the request record to indicate that it was rejected. To do this, we had to tell the wizard which record we wanted to update up in the Smart Object. This is why we use the Record ID data field as an input property for the workflow. Remember that the Record ID field value is set by the form when the workflow was started. We also hard-coded the status that we want to use. In this case, it was the word rejected. This is meant to show how you can use the Smart Objects event in a workflow to call Smart Object method as a server task. Now we need to go and add a notification email to tell the requester that their request was rejected. From the Event Wizard pane over here on the left, you can drag and drop an email event into the Rejected activity and drop it just below the Set Status Rejected event. This email wizard will start as soon as you drop the event, and on the first screen you can click Next to continue. We'll configure the email settings as follows. For the event name, enter in Send Rejected Notification. The From box can be left as the default value. It should say From address. For recipient, uncheck Specify and put a check in the Originator checkbox. For the subject, enter in the following text. Access request for, with a couple of spaces after that, and then put in rejected, and make sure rejected is in all capital letters. We're going to use the Item References tab to insert the full name for this request into the subject line where we put the extra spaces. Now, I'll trust you know where to find that in the context browser, but follow my lead here. Once you've dropped the full name field in the subject line, you can click Next to move on where we'll edit the message body. In this task, we're going to use the context browser and item reference in combination to add some contextual information about the request. I'll enter in the following text, and then drag the full name field over, the company field, the start date, the end date, and then we'll show the originator who the request was rejected by. Feel free to configure this message any way you would like. When you get it completed, you can click Next and then click Finish to complete the wizard. That basically concludes the events we want to execute if the request was rejected. Notice that when building workflows with K2 Studio, you can insert multiple events into the same activity. When the workflow runs, K2 will execute all of the events inside an activity in sequence. This is assuming that the activity was reached in the path of the workflow. Now, we need to go and add an event to create an Active Directory account if one is required. From the Event Wizards pane on the left, drag and drop an Active Directory event into the Create AD Account activity. The Event Wizard will start as soon as you drop the event into the activity. You can click Next to go to the Event Name and Actions screen. On this screen, enter in Create New Account as the event name, and then be sure to select the Create New User action, then click Next. We will be using some inline text functions here to clean up the values entered by the requester, since Active Directory is sensitive to things like leading and trailing spaces. On the Set User Detail screen, let's click the right arrow on the right side of the screen to expand the context browser, and then select the Inline Functions tab. You can go ahead and open up the text group of functions and drag and drop the trim function into the full name text box. The trim function removes extra spaces from both sides of the text that was entered by the user. When you see the Configure Function window appear, go into the context browser and drag the full name property from the temporary access request item reference and drop it in the text box. I'll trust you know how to find this. When you're done with that, you can click Finish. Add the word temp in parentheses after the full name field to indicate that this is a temporary account when people view it in Active Directory lists. Next, we will move on to set up the username property. Drag the trim inline function into the user logon name text box, and configure the function to use the AD username property from the temporary access request item reference. Again, I'll trust you know where to find this under the context browser's Process Activity Data tab. You can click Finish when you're done. For the password, let's enter in K2Pass with an exclamation point and a capital K. Then click Next. To save some time, we won't add any more properties to the new account in Active Directory or create a mailbox for this user. Although, in a real-world environment, if you wanted to populate additional properties for the user or create a mailbox, you can use the context browser to drag and drop variables into fields as necessary, just like you did for the first screens of this wizard. Let's click Next, and Next again, then Finish to complete the Active Directory event wizard. Now we want to add a Smart Object event to set the status of the request to approved. Instead of dragging and dropping and configuring a new Smart Object event though, we can just copy and paste the existing Smart Object event up in the rejected activity and reconfigure it because it already does something similar to what we want to achieve. In the workflow canvas, right-click the Set Status Rejected Event and select Copy from the context menu that appears. Go down and right-click on the Approve step and select Paste. Next, click on the Expand down arrow to show the pasted event. Now we need to edit this event so that it has the right text in it. Move your mouse pointer over the copied event and click the event icon that appears on the right to rerun the wizard for the copied event. Click Next to get to the input mapping screen for the wizard. Then let's change the status property to the word approved. You can edit the status property value here by selecting it and then click the Assign button. That looks good, so we can finish out the wizard and then double-click the copied event and rename it to Set Status Approved. When you get that set up, your workflow should look something like mine here. Let's save our work in K2 Studio now. In this step, we added some server events so that the workflow will perform tasks depending on whether the request was rejected or approved. We also created a new user account in Active Directory for the temporary user, that is, if an account was requested. We also learned how to use inline functions in a wizard and how to copy and paste events into activities and run a wizard again to reconfigure an event. Finally, a couple more takeaways. We looked at how to call a Smart Object method from the workflow in K2 Studio and how to send an email from inside this workflow. At this point, we've reached the end of part 1 in this tutorial. This section was meant to help you with some of the basic workflow steps using K2 Studio. When you're ready, you can move on to part 2 of this tutorial where we will add more advanced design concepts to our workflow. This includes conditional line rules, parallel path setup, escalation, and more.